Good evening from Japan Society here in New York. Ohayo gozaimasu to all of you joining from Japan. Today's topic is incredibly tragic, and I wish we didn't have to discuss it, but it's important in a global context. It's part of what Japan Society's mission is about, of connecting American and Japanese in this moment that we're going to talk about the legacy of Shinzo Abe and the aftermath of his assassination. We put together an amazing panel and a discussion. It's really a conversation of people who knew and are true experts in the field. But I just want to say that Prime Minister Abe, throughout his career, very long career, and numerous occasions, came to New York, and he always was kind to visit us at Japan Society, beginning when he became Prime Minister the second time for the UN General Assembly in 2013. Came back again in 2014, 2015, the list goes on. He most recently joined us for our first annual virtual dinner, and listening to his remarks about the resiliency as New York was going through the epicenter of this pandemic, it really brings to life the leadership of who we're going to talk about today. So we're going to cover Prime Minister Abe's legacy, the impact of his death on Japan, and the foreign policy. I want to thank the sponsors that make this possible. And tonight, the speakers don't really need much of an introduction, so we put their bios out there. Professor Jerry Curtis, everyone knows him as the Japan guy at Columbia University. He's also on the board of Japan Society. We have Ryo Sahashi, who's been a longtime friend. He's an associate professor at the University of Tokyo and a longtime commentator on U.S.-Japan. And our chair, Emeritus Janow, who's dean at Columbia University and also the chair of MasterCard, along with being the chair of Japan Society. So Merit Sensei, let me turn this over to you for this important conversation.
Thank you very much, Joshua. It's a privilege to be with you. I want to start by just acknowledging our shock and sadness at the tragic assassination of former Prime Minister Abe and convey our deepest sympathies to his family, the people of Japan, and many friends around the world. So I ask you to join me in just a moment of silence in recognition. Thank you very much. So today I do feel very fortunate to have a chance to hear from my own distinguished colleague, Gerald Curtis, who I will refer to not as Professor Curtis, but old friend and colleague Jerry Curtis, who's really called the American doyen of Japanese politics and policy. He's known Prime Minister Abe and many Japanese politicians. He's been an observer and writer of Japanese politics and policy for 60 years. Professor Sahashi, a leading Japanese political scientist and expert, so it's a real pleasure to be with both of you and in this conversation. And I think our aim is to have a very broad-ranging discussion about former Prime Minister Abe's impact, his priorities, his legacy, and also look to the future of Japanese policy and priorities, leadership at home and in the world. So in that spirit, I'd like to start with a little discussion about Prime Minister Abe as a leader. You know, there's been such a tremendous outpouring of admiration for former Prime Minister Abe and much commentary about him as a global leader. And as referenced by our President, Joshua Walker, you know, he often came to New York and spent time with us. I remember he spoke at the Global Leaders Forum at Columbia in 2014. He generously came to the 30th anniversary of the Columbia Center on Japanese Economy and Business in Tokyo. He joined smaller group meetings and regularly came to Japan Society. So I just say personally, I appreciated his warmth as a person, his willingness to talk to academics, business leaders, and students about ideas and policy and convey that sense of strategic direction. And these attributes really made him stand out as a leader in my mind. But let me invite Jerry Curtis and Professor Sahashi to share their reflections on former Prime Minister Abe as a leader. Jerry, please.
Well, thank you, Merit. I do want to start by adding my words of condolence to Prime Minister Abe's wife, his 94-year-old mother, Yoko Kishi Abe, other members of his family, and to all the people that feel so sad and are so shocked by what happened to Mr. Abe. You know, he was 67 years old and very energetic and very important. He was the most influential politician in Japan to the day that he died. And so there's a vacuum created by his passing, and we'll talk in a while about what that might mean for Japanese politics. I knew Mr. Abe for 30 years. I remember when he first got elected to the Diet in 1993. I went to see him. We had a long, very interesting discussion. And since, after that, I had many opportunities to interact with him, and I had lots of memories. And I think to get to Merit's point, how does he strike me as a leader? One is he believed a leader should be a leader. A leader should lead. A leader should not just follow what public opinion says or what others say. He knew what he wanted to do, especially on the foreign policy side. He was a strategic thinker, and I'll come back in a while to talk about what that strategy consisted of. But when you talked with Mr. Abe, whether it was about domestic affairs or international affairs, he had a vision. He had a vision of not just the Pacific, but of the Indo-Pacific. And that was what led to the Quad, which was his idea in 2007. He had a vision for Japan, which started out being he was very ideologically on the right of the party, and that remained, but he also was a very pragmatic. He's pragmatic, and he was a realist. And especially in his second term as Prime Minister, he was Prime Minister for a year, from 2006 to 2007 to 2007. That was not very successful. He came back in 2012. In a way, it's a different person. Now he had a clear agenda, Abeonomics, 3 arrows, and making Japan a bigger player on the world stage. He traveled so much all over the world to try to use Japan's influence in positive directions. I happen to note he made 81 international trips and visited 176 countries in his second term as Prime Minister from 2012. He had a lot of accomplishments, and we'll get in and talk about them. But I'll just underscore the point about that in response to Merit's question. He was a forceful leader, and he was, after he died, he was given what in English is called the collar of the Supreme Order of the Chrysanthemum. It's the most senior imperial decoration that Japan has to offer. There have been 4 prime ministers who have received it now. Prime Minister Yoshida, who was a leader for Japan after the Second World War, Prime Minister Sato, and Prime Minister Nakasone, and now Prime Minister Abe. He belongs in that company. He was one of the great leaders of post-war Japan. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Professor Sahashi, please share your thoughts on Mr. Abe as a leader.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I want to show also my condolences to Abe-san's family and wife and mother and the brothers for this big tragedy. I really believe it shouldn't happen to him, but this is a really big loss for this country. And I also want to thank you for your prayers from the United States and from the world for his loss. And we are really moved to see thousands of people, no, hundreds of thousands of people show their condolences to Japan and Mr. Abe. So this is really, really impressive and moving. We are really thankful for that. Mr. Shinzo Abe was the longest prime minister for Japan, and he served for this country more than 2,800 days. it means like more than 80 years and 8 months. So, you know, he was not so successful when he became the prime minister in 2006, taking a shoe from Mr. Koizumi Junichiro, who governed this country for more than 5 years. But the first term for Abe was not so successful. We have to admit that. But as Jerry said, when he came back as prime minister in 2012, he was totally different guy, totally different politician or statesman. He was so determined to lead this country. He was really prepared to bring this country towards a better direction. And, you know, some people and the media say he has some inclination to, you know, kind of nationalism. Yes, he might have that kind of inclination within himself because he loved this country. But, you know, now looking back his 8 years, we found out he was so pragmatic. He didn't bring his own very strong personal thinking to his politics. I mean, he always tried to listen to the people surrounding him. I think, you know, the personality he has is he listened to people very well. Of course, he is also a very good speaker. You know, sometimes a very strong speaker. So sometimes, you know, it caused some criticism from the opposition. You know, he was too much offensive. But I think, you know, he was very good speaker to stick to his idea. But also, I want to emphasize, he listened to the people surrounding him so well, right? And he listened to the best and brightest of this country. And, you know, not only on economic policy, but also on foreign policy. And I believe, you know, one of the most successful aspect of him and legacy Abe left to this country is foreign policy. We can talk about that later, but as my first reaction, first take is he was the guy who really knows how to listen and speak as politicians.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those very personal reflections. It's hard to, in this moment, say enough about the sadness and shock we all feel, but bringing his achievements and his legacy to life in this conversation feels very important. Both of you have suggested that not only was he a remarkable leader, but he's also a very pragmatic person who really had convictions and priorities that came to life in his second term as prime minister. And I wonder if we might turn to talk about some of those. And, you know, it's often said that while he had clearly a set of articulated economic policies, and I hope we can turn to that later in the conversation about the three arrows, that security and foreign policy was really very, very important to him, an area of central conviction and priority. And Jerry, you've already talked about the fact that he played really a key role in creating the Quad of US, Australia, Japan, and India, and strengthening US-Japan relations. And I think of him as remarkably taking TPP forward into TPP when the United States was unable to do so, and working so hard to normalize relations with China and many other things. So I wonder if you could each share your thinking. Does that sound right to you as some of the major priorities and accomplishments Jerry, could you speak
Sure.
to that?
No, I think that's right. I'll tell you, you know, as I said, he was a strategic thinker, and I think his foreign policy strategy was quite clear. He had four prongs to that strategy. The most important was to have a strong alliance with the United States. Abe understood as well as anybody, and better than most, that there is no way to secure Japan without an alliance, the closest possible alliance with the US. And he worked really hard at making that happen. And he, whether it be Obama or Trump, Abe understood he had to have a good personal relationship with the American president and to use opportunities to have that president understand what Japan thought needed to be done about all kinds of issues, not just bilateral issues, but what to do about Asia, how to deal with China, what to do about relating to NATO and to Europe, and so on and so forth. So alliance with the United States. The second thing, which was critical in his thinking, was Japan has to be able to do more itself, more for itself in security terms. And that led to the push that he succeeded in accomplishing, reinterpret the Constitution. He couldn't get it revised, even though that was an early goal, but he never risked losing his government losing power by pushing constitutional revision when he knew it wasn't ripe enough yet to happen. But collective security, being able to come to the assistance of the United States when Japan's own survival was at stake, was at threat. This is very important. And the third was the American alliance is critical, but America is not what it once was. And so Japan needed to, in a way, diversify or augment the alliance with other security relationships, especially with Australia, with ASEAN, with Britain and Europe. And he did, you know, as you can see from all the outpouring of emotion about Abe abroad. I mean, Prime Minister Modi has declared a day of national mourning on the passing of Abe. So you know, developing these other relationships. And finally, to the surprise of a lot of people who thought Abe as a very conservative protectionist, he became the champion of free trade, especially in the aftermath of the U.S. Not joining the TPP. And you know, Obama never submitted it to Congress. Hillary Clinton opposed it in the campaign because she knew it was unpopular. And Trump, of course, you know, trashed it. But he never gave up, and that's how you got TPP, but also always trying to get the Americans to understand why it was so important for them to come into it. And he did that right up until the end. Let me just, without taking much of time, let me say something about his pragmatism and his personality that looking back on episodes I had with him, there's one really lovely episode. He and I happened to be very close friends with a well-known Japanese actor named Tsugawa Masahiko. And one night I think it was 2015, Tsugawa invited us both to his favorite restaurant for dinner. And I went, and then we got a message that Abe was coming back from a lecture tour in Hokkaido, and because of terrible weather, he was going to be very late. So please go ahead and have dinner. I'll come when I can get there. He came about 11 o'clock at night. It was a long day, and it was 11 o'clock. He came with Akie, with his wife, and he must have been exhausted. But he spent more than an hour. It was well past midnight when they left, talking with me about very serious issues and talking with a great intensity about Korea relations and about relations with China. Those two things in particular. But on Korea, I remember he's saying something which kind of stunned me at the time, but is a sign of his pragmatism. He said, you know, this issue of Dokdo, of Takeshima, the island that's an issue of dispute between South Korea and Japan. He said, you know, if the Koreans would not talk about it, it wouldn't be such an issue. We're not going to do anything about Dokdo. If they don't talk about it, I won't talk about it. But if they're going to talk about it, I have no choice. I have to talk about it and give the Japanese position. So he wasn't pushing issues that he knew wouldn't go anywhere, wouldn't get anything that Japan needed to accomplish. And in many respects, this was Abe. And he, on South Korea relations, they didn't like Abe. They thought he was, hit the wrong position on the comfort women and so on. But he finally came to an agreement with President Park Geun-hye that then the Koreans violated. I mean, it was supposed to solve for once and for all, irreversibly, the comfort women issue. He did that, and it didn't work. But even where he failed, he didn't fail for lack of trying. He had 20 some odd meetings, 28 meetings, I think, with Putin to try to resolve the Northern Islands issue, and so forth and so on. He tried on a number of issues to get things done that were very pragmatic. He had a lot of success, not 100% to be certain, but that was the man. That was what he was doing.
Thank you. Sahashi-sensei, tell us from your perspective, do you agree with what Jerry said? Do you think, what do you think of as the real accomplishments and priorities from a policy and security perspective, foreign policy perspective?
Yeah, I think Mr. Abe's strong conviction was the alliance with United States is most important asset for Japan. When he came back as Prime Minister in 2012, he really thought the alliance with United States was not in healthy condition. So he really decided to restore the strong friendship with United States. And, he really made a lot of good speech and remarks to foreign audience. But one of the very good remarks from Mr. Abe, which I really love, is his remarks at CSIS in Washington back to 2012, just 3 months after he came back to power. And he emphasized the reason to keep this alliance as it is. So, of course, he's always very eloquent in his speech, supported by Mr. and Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi. He is now teaching in Keio University. But, but Abe himself always emphasized the importance of the alliance with the United States. Why? Because he really believed the United States as the source of liberalism, liberal international order. And he came up later as the idea of Quad, free and open in the Pacific. And this idea really continued, to spread. That means, United States, EU, UK, Australia, and other countries start to say the same thing in the Pacific, free and open. But and even India joined the quadrilateral cooperation with Japan, United States, and Australia. But the point is, he tried to defend liberal international order, and he thought the United States was the most important partner for that. So I think, of course, the bureaucrats always think the same way, right? But without Abe, we couldn't, they couldn't keep that strong, direction for 8 years. Put in another way, so one of the big advantage of Abe is he governed this country for more than 8 years. From the second term, about 8 years. Mm-hmm. It really means a lot to our foreign policy. We succeeded in, keeping the same message to the world. And the second point I want to mention is, it might be surprising to you, but he really emphasized importance of diplomacy. He is, of course, he succeeded in increasing the defense budget a little bit. But the most important way to enhance our capability for him is to keep the good diplomacy with our neighboring countries, not only with the United States, but he succeeded in having a negotiation with China, South Korea, ASEAN, and even Russia. You know, like the ASEAN is a really good case. You know, when he came back to power, within 12 months, within 1 year, he visited all capitals of ASEAN, all capitals, 10 capitals. So he, you know, really love, get bored on his plane, you know, to travel around the world. So the impression for many Japanese is he always loved traveling, foreign traveling, right? But he sacrificed, you know, his health, I believe, you know, for this numerous foreign travel. But he really believe, you know, the diplomatic negotiation is very important, even with China, right? So we really did have strong trouble with the giant, our neighbor giant, China. After 2010 and 2012, we had 2 incidents nearby our Senkaku Islands. And our relationship with China was really bad when he came back. But he finally succeeded in restoring our diplomatic relationship with China. It is debatable, you know, but still, you know, China is one of the most important country for Japanese economy and society. And to keep good diplomacy with China also contribute to stabilize our neighboring areas. So he visited China and met with Xi Jinping so many times. And also Xi Jinping and China wanted to keep negotiation with Abe because they knew Abe was really strong leader of Japan. So the big legacy for us is, you know, he really restored our relationship with, you know, not only with United States, but also with China. His diplomacy with South Korea was, of course, finally in vain. But as Jerry said, you know, he tried. With Park Geun-hye, he, you know, he completed the negotiation over comfort women issue. So, you know, he was really believer of negotiation and diplomacy. This is my second point. And sadly, just one sentence. As Jerry said, I just want to echo Jerry's point. He was champion of rule making and international norms. So he protected TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, after the United States withdrew from participation. And also, he also tried to promote other rule-making process in many areas, including data. So we have to praise and evaluate him from this angle too.
Thank you very much. Those are all great points. And I'm beginning to see some questions and comments coming in. Please keep them coming and we'll try and bring them into our conversation as well. I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of these key foreign policy relations and say just a little bit more about China. He was working hard to normalize relations and deal with the island's issues. I heard there was even thought that perhaps President Xi was being talked about of visiting Japan before COVID hit. So this was an ongoing effort. Jerry, what do you think? Where was the progress made and what were the stumbling blocks?
Well, on China, I don't think Abe actually gets enough credit for how hard he worked to try to normalize relations after he became prime minister the second time. And his view, at least as I understood it from conversations with him, was you have to try to have a good relationship with China because China is so important, especially economically, but also its growing importance in the balance of power in the region. You want to have a good relationship with China, but you're not going to be pushed around. I once was on a panel discussion with him, TV program, about China, and he got very exercised. And after it ended, we went to the makeup room, and he wanted to continue the conversation for 50 minutes and for longer. And what he said was, we have to try to have a good relationship with China, but Japan has never kowtowed to China, and it never will. And that was very key to him. It was important that the Chinese understand that they can't push him around or push Japan around, and that the Senkaku Islands is something they should not get aggressive about, because Japan will respond. So it's very complicated. It was very difficult. But, you know, the plan was for Xi Jinping to reciprocate Abe's visit to Beijing by going to Japan in 2019. And if COVID hadn't occurred, that would have happened. So to take that forward, the question is now, what will Japan do dealing with China, dealing with South Korea, dealing with North Korea, which we haven't talked about, but which Abe was very much concerned about, as you know, obviously. What does his absence mean? That's a big question mark that we'll have to talk about. But I think I would just underscore something, you know, what Sahashi said. He really worked hard at trying to improve these two critical relationships in the region, with South Korea and with China. He made progress, but then for various reasons, the rug was kind of pulled out from under that. Either it was COVID with China relations, and it was the domestic politics of the comfort women in South Korea, and so on. But yeah, the overall assessment is that he was pragmatic, he was a realist, and he was tough. He was forceful and he was tough. He didn't push Abe around, but he listened, and he tried to find ways to resolve issues.
Mm-hmm. And Russia, I mean, there's another, I mean, I think, Jerry, you said that he had more than 20 meetings with Putin, doubtless trying to resolve those islands issues. Sahashi-sensei, do you have any comments about Russia and those tireless efforts?
Yes. Just before that, just one sentence to what Jerry said about China. So on China, finally, Xi Jinping couldn't come to here. Yeah, it makes sense, because, you know, if Xi Jinping came to Japan that time, you know, maybe that could give impression to not only to Japan, but to the world, you know, we compromise our principle, you know, to welcome Xi Jinping here. But, you know, when Abe restored the relationship with China back to 2014 APEC meeting, and then go onward, he didn't compromise anything, right? And he maintained the economic and social relationship with China at a really low cost. So it was a secret of Abe's diplomacy with China. He didn't compromise anything. Having said that, on Russia and President Putin, it is really tough. And a question. It was, I have to admit, big failure, finally. Abe was too soft on Russia. He, you know, the negotiation he had with President Putin is very numerous, more than 20 times. But you know, he couldn't get a big compromise or deal from President Putin. So all efforts are in vain. So Abe was misguided. But that happened maybe by his advisor. And, you know, and they are simply deceived by Russians' way of communication to us. After Abe retired from Prime Minister, we saw many publications on his negotiation with Russia, and almost all books have very negative view on his negotiation. So I have to admit, his efforts to negotiate with Putin was unsuccessful, but it is too tough or not fair for us to push all responsibility to his shoulders. He was misguided, not only by his own advisor, but also by President Putin.
Nara, let me just add one word on the Russia issue. I agree with what Sahashi said. So, but the two points. One, you would think after 20 some odd meetings, he should have realized that he was being played by Putin. But he, and maybe he did realize it, but he still was looking, kind of hoping that he would find some way to break through. The other thing about the Russia Northern Islands issue, it was important to his domestic constituency, to people among his supporters. So even though the meetings didn't succeed, it was appreciated by people who were really concerned about that issue in Japan that he's trying. So, I'm not as, looking back now that he's passed, I'm not as critical as I was at the time. Yeah, it didn't work, but what was the alternative? Not to meet with Putin? That wouldn't have led to any kind of result. So he tried and he failed. You don't win every battle.
We could use all of our time so easily talking about these policy and foreign policy issues with each of the major fault lines, and we haven't spoken enough about North Korea. But I do want to ask, turn to economics in a second, but ask, have there been any structural changes around security and foreign policy coming out of this period that we should be aware of, particularly for an American audience? For example, it's often said that he strengthened the role of the Prime Minister's office itself to deal with security and foreign policy issues. And while he didn't able to amend the Constitution, you alluded to that, Jerry, there was a reinterpretation that opened the door to perhaps a different approach to some of the issues around security. So I just want to, before we leave this topic, ask you both, do you think there have been some, in effect, structural aspects that will carry forward around the role of the Prime Minister on foreign policy and security?
Yes, two. Go ahead. So I was saying, if you want to go first, you go first. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, maybe I can go first. Thank you, Jerry. He really changed the platform on national security and foreign policy. One of the big success is National Security Council and National Security Secretariat. Before he restructured the system, we didn't have any National Security Council equivalent to White House in Japan, right? But now we have National Security Secretariat, and within that building, we have less than 100 people who came from all ministries of the government, not only from MOFA, diplomats and Ministry of Defense. We have many officials from like Coast Guard or Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy and Trade, and also from other ministries. So what he made is kind of the all government approach to national security. And also he was the first prime minister who published national security strategy of Japan. So, it was really big for us. We finally got the kind of the gravity of power to promote our national security policy beyond not beyond the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it was big restructure. And also he changed the interpretation of Article 9 to let us exercise a collective self-defense right. So it was also very meaningful, especially for our alliance with the United States.
Thank you. Jerry, did you want to comment? But I think
I agree. I think Hassan just summed it up right. There was one more thing, a structural change that was very important, which was to increase the Prime Minister's office control over the recruitment of top bureaucrats. So that led to a lot of criticism that The bureaucrats were looking to what the prime minister wanted and to give it to him, whether they thought it was right or not, because they were worried about their own careers. I think the criticism is overdone. What Abe wanted to do was, it's the prime minister and the elected politicians that the public has chosen to run the country. They should run the country, and they should need to work closely with bureaucrats, but the bureaucrats have to be responsive. And so that combination, the National Security Secretariat, Council Secretariat, plus greater control over who becomes the leading bureaucrats, it was a formidable combination, and it made the Kante stronger than it had ever been before. This all goes, there's a history here. Going back to a Prime Minister, Hashimoto, in the late 90s, he began the system, this process of centralizing power in the Kante, in the Prime Minister's office. Koizumi built on it, and Abe made it work as it had never had before.
Well, thank you. I think, while I'm talking to two eminent political scientists, so we're talking a lot about security and foreign policy. But of course, we should also talk about economics and economic growth and foreign economic policy a little bit. And, his three arrows were a clear articulation of economic priorities around aggressive monetary policy, flexible fiscal policy, and structural reform. And I wonder how you would assess those. And of course, another thing that really stands out was his womanomics articulation, which I think, had very important and got a lot of attention around the world as well. So when we think about the three arrows and his economic priorities, I think many people give him a lot of praise for the first two, and sometimes say that the structural reform was unfinished business, but that there were important things identified around reforming pension funds and labor market reforms and consolidating stock and commodity exchange. That there were things that were done, but that was an area where more progress is needed. And I just invite, again, we've got questions coming in saying, how much did these reforms contribute to growth and vitality of the Japanese economy? I invite you each to comment. Sasha, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm a political scientist, so I'm not a specialist on economy. But, as Emeritus said, he had three arrows of Japanese economy. One is monetary policy, and second is fiscal policy, and third is growth policy. For me, monetary policy made a contribution to push up our stock market price, and also, energize our economy the most. During his tenure, the stock market price, I believe, at least experienced 3 times growth. So it is very big growth, and we have to appreciate that. But on the fiscal policy and growth strategy, I have to admit there were so many limitations of his strategy, and fiscal policy. Of course, it is not always his fault, but our fiscal condition is not so good. Too many national debt, and he couldn't bounce back this trend. So fiscal situation is still the very big headache for Japanese economy. And on the growth strategy, we still failing to change this country's economy. Big company still big dinosaur, and we have many agenda in digital transformation. So we are still far behind from the real economic recovery. Growth policy. And finally about womenomics. I think it was good to start. he said, we have to use more female power to economy and society. And he tried to introduce some new system for female workers to work more efficiently at their working place. But, again, it is not always his fault, but, we still have many problems for female workers in the office. It is more cultural barriers, but he was really good. Try to touch on this agenda and to call it as Abeonomics. So it was a good try.
Jerry?
Yeah, well, we don't have much time. I'll be very brief. I think the monetary policy, like first of all, getting Mr. Kuroda to be the head of the Bank of Japan, reflate to get Japan out of deflation. That was very important. Also, and maybe this is the most important point, he was in power for 8 years. It's hard sometimes to remember what it was like in the early years. The first 2 or 3 years was a very exciting time because he set goals. He had a vision on the economy, and he had catchphrases so that everybody understood what he was talking about. 3 arrows, Abeonomics, and so on. This created a lot of excitement and a lot of interest in the Japanese economy among foreigners and foreign investors, and also gave some hope to Japanese themselves. Now, these are very difficult issues, and no matter how powerful the prime minister is, there's a limit on what you can accomplish. And on structural reform, let's not forget he did one very big, important structural change. That was to liberalize Japanese agriculture. That was a big deal. And that made possible, these international free trade agreements and so on that Japan was involved in. I was always critical of Abe on these issues in one respect. He never said, in the next 6 months, within the next year, I am going to accomplish this, X. And if it can't be done, then you get somebody else in this job. That was actually Koizumi's approach. I'm here to get a job done. If I can't get the job done, find somebody else to sit in this chair. Abe was always more hesitant to risk everything to try to push something through. On these structural reforms, you can't get it done unless you use all the power that you have. So he gets kind of a grade of incomplete on some of these aspects of Abeonomics, but I think look at it in the historical perspective, he pushed things forward, made the country a little bit more optimistic. It kind of dissipated over time, but you can't blame him entirely for all of that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think these are hard areas to reform, and their growth impacts are also not a straight line. So I think you put some good, important points on the table. I'm getting a few questions from our audience, and you've answered a few in different ways. But I think we should talk a little bit now about the future. And I invite those watching to continue to send questions. We'll try and embed them in your responses. But of course, we've just had a recent election, which was a sweeping victory for the LDP and the Prime Minister. And if we look inside the LDP and Japanese politics, Mr. Abe was the head of the largest faction, of course. So I think it's interesting to ask ourselves, what do we think will happen within the LDP with this terrible tragedy? We're going to see shifts in coalitions, and will that just be factional politics, or will there be policy consequences? I wonder if, Jerry, could you speak to how we should think about that issue?
So as you said, Mr. Abe led the largest faction, 92 and 93 members. There's no apparent successor. There are maybe 3 or 4 individuals in that faction that want to lead it. They may create this kind of collective leadership for a while, but that's not a long-term solution, because the point of becoming head of a faction is that you become prime minister. So they'll end up fighting with each other. I think we're going to see a period of politicking politicking in the LDP, factional politics in the LDP with little policy implication. That would be my guess about the politics. There are two other things I would say about politics. The second is I'm a little is how politicians who want to rise to the top here, how they try to get the public to understand what the dangers are that Japan faces and what Japan has to do to deal with them. Post-war Japan, there was this sense of confidence that Japan is safe, it's secure, and prosperity lies ahead. Those assumptions are no longer, they're under a great deal of threat. And so, there's pressure from the right, kind of populist pressure, kind of a Trumpian approach. There are people like that in the LDP. There are others who are cool and rational and want to make changes, but are rather maybe too cautious. How is all this going to play out? My bottom line, my guess, my best guess, there'll be a lot of politicking without much policy implication. That the basic foreign policy line, this is something Sahashi actually got to very early in this conversation. The basic policy line will be a continuation of Abe's foreign policy. I don't see any major changes away from Abe, but can they implement it with the kind of determination and intelligence that Abe brought to it? You can have the continuation of the line, but if you don't have a continuation of strong political leadership to push it, things will decelerate. And so I don't think you're going to see an acceleration of the trends that Abe got on that was pushing. You may see a deceleration, or you'll see just a status quo. This is not a time for a status quo. The world is too messed up for status quo politics. But we'll just have to see how that plays out.
Well, that's a fascinating question. Sahashi-san, how do you see? Do you see the Prime Minister Kishida seeing as continuing these major thrusts we've been talking about, or do you see areas where there could be a slowdown or an acceleration? He's already started to articulate some new concepts. This new capitalism idea has come out. Also, I've heard recent talk about trying to strengthen entrepreneurship, which I think of as very important for Japan to do. You mentioned the digital initiatives that I think were associated with Mr. Abe, but also Prime Minister Suga advanced, I thought, the digital agency. What areas do you see as accelerating or changing in emphasis?
Thank you for that question. Yes, Kishida started to show his own vision. He has now 3 years of golden moment. That means, we don't have any big elections in coming 3 years if he will not dissolve the lower house. He always can have a snap election for the lower house, but if he don't use his power for that, he could secure 3 years. So he has his own agenda on economy. We still don't know what is new capitalism, but if he really means it, he may want to bring economic policy to support more weaker people. I mean, he emphasized the social security net for the middle class people. But on foreign policy, he recently showed his Kishida vision in Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore last month. And he emphasized nuclear disarmament is one of his big agenda. And economic security is also one of his 5 pillars of Kishida vision. So he has his vision. He has good advisors surrounding him, including Mr. Kihara Seiji, Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary, and very powerful guy. But having said that, the difficulty for him is he doesn't have Mr. Yoshihide Suga. That means, Abe-san, Shinzo Abe had Yoshihide Suga as chief cabinet secretary. Very, genius or talented politicians who control the government system. But Kishida still need more backup system for his administration. But the second, more importantly, is Abe-san was good talking partner for Kishida after he resigned. I mean, Abe led the biggest group of LDP and a very powerful guy, but he was, the guy Kishida can talk. Mm. And if Abe agreed, Kishida could be assured, he could promote this policy. But now without such big guy, big gravity, Kishida really have difficulty to control the LDP itself. So Abe group might be maintained by collective leadership, but who Kishida can talk? This is a big issue. Mm. So Kishida has a good agenda, but intra-party governance is biggest agenda for him.
Jerry, I think you were starting to speak in a similar vein, and we have just a couple of minutes left. So I'd like to just invite you to say a little bit more about that, because, the world is becoming a dangerous place. It's, as you said, it's even more dangerous. And so there is some urgency, I think, to being able to push forward national priorities. And so which are the ones that you feel are really most starkly facing Japan at this time? And I'd just like to invite you both to spend a moment on that.
Well, that's a good and it's a tough question. First, I think the point, something Sahashi said, may seem surprising to some of our listeners. With this powerful leader in Mr. Abe now gone, Kishida, some people think, is in a stronger position. But Kishida is probably in a weaker position because first of all, he doesn't have Mr. Abe, who, when he agrees with Kishida, can be assured that the more right-leaning politicians in the LDP will go along because they would do what they would go along with Abe. The second is that Abe knew, really understood foreign affairs and had a political sense of what can and could be, what could be done and what could not be done. And so not having him to talk to, not having him around does not strengthen Kishida. If we knew that Kishida has a history of being a very powerful leader, that would be one thing. But the impression that Kishida has left so far is that he's not all that decisive. Well, Japan needs decisive leadership, whether it be Kishida alone or with a collective leadership. Japan, it's not only that the dangers, not only the sense that Japan is not as safe and secure as it once was because the US is weaker, Prime Minister gets assassinated, but you have China being very aggressive. You have the problem of Taiwan. Taiwan we didn't talk about it tonight, but Taiwan is a very critically important issue for Japan. A Chinese attack on Japan, on Taiwan, would be seen as a direct threat to Japan. North Korea, more and more missiles, more and more nuclear weapons. Russia relations having spiraled downward because of the Ukraine war, so on and so forth. Well, Japan needs leadership to deal with these kinds of issues. It's not one particular issue, it's this package. The international order is unraveling or is changing. Abe had a sense of how to restructure, or at least how to amend it to strengthen that order. Does Ishida and the other people who will be running the country now, do they have a similar view, a similar understanding of the challenges? And can they sell it to the public? Can they sell what needs to be done, which it may not be very public? Can they sell it to the public? It's a tall order. Abe had I think Abe had a very good chance of having another term as prime minister. He's only 67 years old, but that's not going to happen. And now we don't know what will happen. So that's the situation. It's a big question mark about what the implications are for the future.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I want to give Sahashi-san at least 30 seconds to offer one comment, if you don't mind. I would just say the international order is changing, and there are many risks in the system. And the importance of Japan as a leader in the world is very, very apparent. And significant steps have been taken in recent years that have made Japan so important in the region with the United States. But before we close, let me thank you both and invite Sahashi-san to make a final comment for just a moment, if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I totally agree with Jerry and Mary say, and that is Abe will be missed so much, in coming years, because now the world is very tough, not only with Russia, but also with North Korea and China. Japan is surrounded by, such very big actors, right? Russia, North Korea, and China. So Kishida will publish his own national security strategy towards the end of this year. So we can wait and see what he will say in his own national security strategy. But I really try to keep hope. He will be champion of liberal international order, and he will be determined to increase our defense capability. But also, I really want to see Kishida will put emphasis on the diplomatic negotiation with neighbors. Not only deterrence, alliance, but also diplomatic efforts are really important. But keep the liberal international order as principle is most important. So I try to be optimistic for him, but still, I believe Abe Shinzo will be missed by his own skill and experience.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank Joshua Walker for bringing us together this morning. I feel like we've started a number of important conversations here today, none of which we could take as far as we would like, but I'm grateful for the chance to exchange views with both of you. Thank our audience very much for being with us in Japan and in the United States at this time of great reflection on Japan at home and in the world. Thank you all very much.